Hi, welcome to another session of Psalms 23. I'm having a wonderful time doing this. I hope you're enjoying it yourself as much as I am. There may not be a handful of watchers out there, but we're having a good time, aren't we? Yeah. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. That's where we're going to be tonight. I'm going to talk about this subject. Now, from a shepherd's point of view, this passage that we're talking about tonight is the halfway point of the psalm. But it's also a specific time for the sheep. Because you see, up until this time, the sheep have been kind of sitting around the home ranch, getting fat, bragging about all the good treatment that they've gotten all the time they've been sitting there from winter through the spring. But now it's time for them to move out. It's time for them to hit the road and get out of the farm and start finding their own food rather than eating the stuff that's fed to them day by day. So the sheep now, and he begins to address the shepherd directly. Now to start to use, if you'll notice the use of the personal pronouns, I and you, they enter into the conversation now. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. See, it becomes the most intimate discourse of deep affection here between the shepherd and his sheep. Now, winter's over, and summer's on its way, it's spring, and this time, like I said, it's time for them to move out. And so this often entails long drives. The sheep move along slowly, feeding as they go, gradually working their way up the mountain behind the receding snow. And during this time, the flock is entirely alone with the shepherd. Gives him time to really get to know his sheep. He gets to know each one individually. He knows what the shortcomings are. He knows the ones that are healthy, the ones that are not too healthy. He knows the ones that are with lamb, the ones that aren't. He knows all about them, and he has them all named, remember. So he's paying personal attention day and night to these sheep. And that's why these last verses in this psalm contain such intimate first-person language. And remember, all of this is done against a dramatic background of wild mountains and rushing rivers and meadows and high rangelands. But those 7 words, the valley of the shadow of death. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. They represent one of the most enduring images in human literature. Well, you might not think so, because it sounds kind of weird, eerie. But to David, it wasn't just a poetic notion. He was describing a real place. See, some people speculate that the Wadi Kelt was a specific gorge in David's mind as he penned a line in this poem. Now, the word Wadi is a Middle Eastern term meaning deep valley or ravine. And the Wadi Hill that he was talking about was a gorge that runs between Jerusalem and Jericho. It has some deep valleys and deep gorges and really some real rough terrain if you try going through that way, which I have, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. But this is what they think he may have been talking about. I have some pictures here. I don't know if you are able to see them or not. I wish I had was able to show you the slides. But this is an aerial shot of what we're called the Wadi Kelt. Up here is Jerusalem, and down here is Jericho. And this ran down through this area of deep, deep gorge. Just think about it. Thousands of years, shepherds have herded their sheep back and forth down through there. Thousands of years. Here's another aerial view of it. And this time you can see the highway that goes through it. Highway traveling up through here. That was smart. Pull the wrong one off. And this should give you an idea of what it looked like down inside it. You notice there's some people down here, and give you an idea of the size. The deep, steep walls. The vegetation the sheep could eat. Water, running water down through there. Here's another shot of it. Just to give you an idea of what they were talking about. This also now is the route that Jesus would have taken in his biblical times as he left Galilee and was traveling down through to Jerusalem. That was the route that they took. It was the only well-known route through there. Now, I told you I'd tell you a little bit about that highway. Let me tell you about it in just a minute. I want to finish telling you about Jesus using this, getting ahead of myself. Jesus used this to travel, this area to travel. And even in the midst of it, in the middle of it there's an area that he used in his story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10. He was talking about the traveler was going through this area, through this wadi, this gorge, and that's where the bandits got on. Okay, so it was referred to in our Lord's day. It was referred to as the way of blood because of the treachery of the bandits and the wild animals there. Okay, now I told you I was going to tell you about it. On one of our trips to the Holy Land, we were able to drive. We drove from Turkey over through Syria up to Damascus. Spent some time there, did some sightseeing. Then from Damascus, we drove down to Beirut. Now this was all before the 7-Day War. This was before they closed the borders, so we could travel pretty freely. And Beirut was a beautiful town at those days. Oh, it was gorgeous. Used to go there for the weekends. But then when we traveled on over to Israel, into the Holy Land, and drove around while we were in there. And one of our day trips we took was from Jerusalem down to Jericho to see where Jesus was baptized. And what we had to do is we took that road because it was the only way to go. And it was a horrible road. I mean, it was narrow, it was crooked, winding down through there, and you could just almost feel the impact of things coming down on you. But now they've since built a superhighway all the way across. And even after they built that superhighway from Jerusalem to Jericho, they've still had that other one open for people to travel. But recently, I understand, I don't know for sure, but I've been told that they closed that off because of terrorists and using it for bombing and stuff. So, just thought I'd throw that in for a little extra. Okay. David, of course, he knew this type of terrain from firsthand experience. I mean, he'd experienced all the difficulties and dangers as well as the delights of a trip to this high country. It's because again and again and again and again he'd gone up into the summer range with his sheep. He didn't just go once, he went over and over again. He knew this wild and wonderful country like the palm of his own strong hand. He never looked took his flock anywhere he had not already been before. And always he'd gone ahead and looked over the country with care. All the dangers and the rampaging rivers and the flooding, the avalanches, the rock slides, the poisonous plants, the ravages of predators that raided the flock, and all of the storms with the sleet and the hail and the snow, they were all familiar to him. He'd been through every one. You probably couldn't name anything he hadn't experienced. He'd handled it, and he'd handled his sheep and managed them with care under all these adverse conditions. In other words, nothing took him by surprise. He was fully prepared to safeguard his flock no matter what, and he tended them with skill under every circumstance. Now, all of this brought out a beautiful simplicity in the next verse. Here's a grandeur, a quietness, and an assurance that sets the soul at rest. What is it you say? I will fear no evil, for you are with me. I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. We speak of moving on up to higher ground. We talk about, I'm going to move up to the big leagues. I want to have this. I want to have that. I want to get more and more. And we almost feel like we can just be airlifted up there. We don't have to work to get there or anything else. But on the rough trail of Christian life, that's not so. See, just like sheep, God's people can only gain higher ground by climbing up through the valleys. That's the only way we can get there. There's another reason why sheep are taken to the mountaintop by the way of the valleys. It's not only is this the way of the gentlest grade, but it's also the well-watered route. Here we'll find refreshing water all along the way. There's rivers and streams and springs and quiet pools and valleys. As Christians, sooner or later we're going to learn that that's in the valleys of our lives that we find refreshments from God Himself. Hear that, please. In the valleys of our lives, as we find refreshments from God. Some years ago, I don't even know, I heard an expression. I have no recollection at all who said it, but it stuck with me. And it's an important saying to me. It's nothing ever grows on the mountaintop. Nothing ever grows on a mountaintop. You get up past the tree line, nothing grows up there, right? So people want to stay on the mountaintop all the time and have these mountaintop experiences. Well, while you're on that mountaintop and you're having those mountaintop experiences, you are not growing. You only grow down in the valleys. See? Well, it's not until we walked with Him through some very deep troubles that we discover that He can lead us to find our refreshment in Him right there in the midst of all our difficulties. Most of us don't want valleys in our lives. We shrink from them with a sense of fear and foreboding. Yet in spite of our worst misgivings, God can bring great benefit, lasting benediction to others through those valleys. So let's not always try to avoid the dark things, the distressing days, because remember, this is the day that God has made. Rejoice, be glad in it. This may well prove to be the way of the greatest refreshment to ourselves and those around us. Now, another reason why the shepherd chose to take his flock into the high country by way of the valleys is that this is generally where the richest feed and best forage is to be found, along this route. Naturally, the grassy glades are often on the floor of the steep wall canyon and gulches, and these towering cliffs above them on either side. Now, the valley floor itself down here where the stuff is growing, where the sheep are, will be in dark shadow most of the time because the sun seldom reaches down through here. Just maybe a few hours around noon that it's down there. So it's a dark valley. The shepherd knows from past experience, though, that predators like coyotes and bears and wolves and cougars and other animals can take cover in those broken cliffs and from their vantage point to prey on the flock. He knows the valleys can be subject to sudden storms, flash floods, send walls of water down, rampaging down these slopes. And there could be rock slides, rocks tumbling down, mudslides, snow, even avalanches in the wintertime. And any of a dozen other natural disasters that would destroy or injure his sheep. But in spite of such hazards, he always knows that it's still the best way to take his flock up to the high country. So he's going to take him on the best way. He'll just protect them. Now, our shepherd, Jesus Christ, knows all of this when he leads us through the valleys. He knows where we can find strength and sustenance and gentle grazing. Despite every threat or disaster about us, he knows that we'll be safe because we're under his care. And when David wrote about the dark valleys, or the valley of the shadow of death, he did so from his two unique perspectives. The first one, we've talked about this, David knew the shepherd's perspective. He had been a shepherd. And of course, and as a shepherd, he had led these sheep through these valleys and in order to get them to greener pastures. He knew how timid the sheep could be when the valley was dark. He was familiar with the role of protector. He should be. Remember back when he was getting ready to fight Goliath, and he came before Saul, and Saul wanted to know kind of what his qualifications were. And over in 1 Samuel 17, 34, 35, he said, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. That was his qualification. Not only to fight Goliath, but to be a shepherd. Now, the second reason, the second perspective that he had, first was that he was a shepherd. The second one, he knew the perspective of being a sheep. Remember, we talked about that earlier. He knew what it felt like to be a sheep, walking through the dark valleys of his own life. He wasn't all clean. Remember, he did quite a few things. If you ever have a question of that, think about Bathsheba. David was actually had a man killed, and he committed adultery, and a lot of things. But God forgave him, and he turned his life around, and he became the apple of God's eye. And he was writing this from that perspective, that he'd walked through the valleys of his own in the dark life. He knew how much he needed his shepherd to lead him and comfort him and to help him get through. So he would know that same thing for his sheep. He understood both perspectives. And he talks about the shadow of death. Now, Bible translators agree that the most accurate translation for the Hebrew for the phrase shadow of death, is darkest valleys. The Hebrew word for this phrase is salmawet, S-A-L-M-A-W-E-T. And that means dark shadows or darkness. And it shares the same Hebrew root for death. The root for death is mawet, M-A-W-E-T, mawet. So it makes total sense that it's translated as the shadow of death. David is specifically using the word walk through because the phrase denotes movement and progress. We don't stop in the valley. Keep that in mind. We don't stop in the valley and buy a house and live there forever. Valleys are conduits for passing through. They have an entrance, they have an exit. Valleys have a beginning and they have an end. They're passages that take you from where you are to where you're going. They're not dead ends. They're passage-throughs. And so fear focuses on the shadows, while faith focuses on the shepherd. The valley of the shadow of death. Another important word in the verse 4 is shadow. It's not the valley of death. It's the shadow of the valley of death. Now, let me explain what this you're talking about here, at least get to in my estimation. I was in Japan and I went to the train station. And while I was in that train station, they have what they call a bullet train. You've probably heard of it. It can travel 200-300 miles an hour. And the train was coming through the station, or it came through the station while it was there, and it didn't stop. And it zoomed through, probably 200-300 miles an hour. I don't know. It was moving. And I was standing there, and the shadow of that train went over me. Now, if I had been standing on the tracks and the train hit me 200-300 miles an hour, I'd have been a grease spot. But it wasn't. The shadow hit me, and it startled me, but it didn't hurt me. Did no harm whatsoever. So it was just the shadow of the train. I read a story about a pastor whose wife died and left him with 2 young children. And he was having trouble explaining to those children what had happened to their mother. Oh yeah, he was able to convince them that she was in heaven and all, but couldn't tell them exactly what had happened. And they were sitting outside on a bench, and the delivery truck drove by. And when it did, the shadow of that truck passed over them. And he asked the little girl, he says, "Did you see that truck?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "It passed by, right?" She said, "Yes." "Did it harm you?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I wasn't in front of it. It didn't hit me." "Well, did you see the shadow of the truck?" "Yes." "Did it pass over you?" "Yes." "Did it hurt you?" "No." "Why?" "Because it was just a shadow." And that's what death is. It's just a shadow of death. It's what it is for a Christian. There's no such thing as real death for a Christian, because, you see, the Good Shepherd, our Savior, Jesus Christ, he laid down his life for his sheep, us. And he bore our death full force on the cross. And as a result, we're not hit by that death because he took it for us. We just see the shadow of death. So there's no such thing as real death for the Christian. So we can say, "I will fear no evil." Now Psalms 23:4, then it just isn't a piece of poetry or a line of poetry. It encases our deepest doctrines and the most biblically cherished beliefs about God's presence in the valley of life. So as a result, we'll fear no evil. So if we can paraphrase it kind of like this, it says, "Even in the darker moments of life or in death, I will not give way to panic or anxiety. With the Lord with me, there's no room for fear." Isn't that good? If the Lord with me, there's no room for fear. "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Now when it came to sheep, the shepherd used the rod to firmly guide and protect the flock. And he used the staff to draw the sheep to himself and keep them close. And both actions of the shepherd brought the sheep comfort because they felt secure and safe and seen by their shepherd. He was watching over them. Now the Hebrew word for rod is shibet, S-H-E-B-E-T, shibet. It was originally referred to as part of a tree. Some people say it's the shepherd's other hand. The Hebrew word for staff now is mishinah, M-I-S-H-E-N-A-H, mishinah. And it carries the thought of something to lean on or trust or support. You see all these shepherds leaning on their staff. Now in the Middle East, the shepherd carries a rod and a staff. That's his implements. That's his arsenal for protection of his sheep. He carries a rod and a staff, and he was watching over and shepherding their sheep. He has a long, slender stick called a staff. It's a rough hand-carved club in the other hand. It's called a rod. And these are the common universal equipment for the primitive sheep man. Now, you might find this interesting. Each shepherd boy, from the time he first starts to tend his father's flock, he takes special pride in the selection of a rod and a staff exactly suited to fit his size and his strength. Got his own special thing. Now he goes into the brush and he selects a young sapling tree growing out, and he digs it up from the roots. And then he spends time with a knife carving it, whittling it down, whittling and carving it and smoothing it. Does it with great care. And then the enlarged base, where the tree, where its trunk joined the roots, is shaped into a smooth round head of hardwood. He smooths that out, hardwood. And the tree itself that he pulled out, then he whittles on it and he shapes it exactly to fit his own hand, nobody else's. And after he completes it, the shepherd boy then spends hours and hours and hours practicing with that club, learning how to throw it with amazing speed and accuracy. Those guys can throw that and they can kill a fly on a post with it. They have contests. You know, here our kids have different kinds of contests, shooting bows and arrows, or I guess now, from what I understand, Pastor Jason was telling me one of the trends around is throwing axes, or shooting, you know, whatever. But these shepherd boys, they were throwing into a contest, were throwing their rods to see how good they could be. But not only that, they were honing their own experience, honing their own abilities to protect their sheep. This rod becomes his main weapon of defending himself and his sheep. In fact, it becomes an extension of his arm. He carries that. He has it in his arm, in his hands most of the time. Now it's a standout as a symbol of strength. It's a symbol of power. It's a symbol of his authority in any serious situation. The rod was what he relies on to safeguard both himself and his flock in danger. It's an instrument that's used to discipline and correct a wayward sheep. They insisted on wandering away. He uses it to wrap them up beside the head. You know, spare the rod and spoil the sheep, so to speak. Remember when God called Moses from the burning bush? They were out in the middle of the desert, weren't they? And what was Moses doing out there? He was shepherding his sheep. He was a shepherd. God spoke to him out of the bush. And when he spoke to him out of the bush, he sent him to deliver Israel out of Egypt and from under the Pharaoh's bondage. It was his rod that was to demonstrate the power vested in him. It was always through that rod that the miracles were made manifest, not only to convince Pharaoh of Moses' divine commission, but also to reassure the people of Israel. One thing I learned about that rod is, remember when Moses was out in the desert, God called him from behind the bush, from out of the fiery bush, burning bush. He said, "Moses, what's that you got in your hand?" Moses said, "That's my rod." And isn't it funny that we people here in the States, back in the early times, in the 30s and so forth, the gangsters, they called their pistol their rod. And here this shepherd's got rod. Moses got his rod. God says, "What is that in your hand?" Moses says, "My rod." God says, "Throw it on the ground." He throws it on the ground. And what happened to it? It became a snake, right? And he says, "Pick it up." Moses reached out, picked it up by the tail, and it turned into a rod again. Now, before he did that, it was the Bible called it the rod of Moses, Moses' rod. But after he picked it up, from then on, it was the rod of God. The rod of God that he did all those miracles with. Okay, let's talk about the staff now. In a sense, the staff more than any other item of his personal equipment identifies a shepherd as a shepherd. No one in any other profession carries a shepherd's staff. They just don't. You don't see a policeman carrying a shepherd's staff. You don't see a fireman with a shepherd's staff. She is a shepherd with a shepherd's staff, right? It's uniquely an instrument used to care for the care and the management of sheep. Only sheep. You can't use that staff for herding cattle. You can't use it for driving horses. You can't use it for shuffling hogs around. It's designed and shaped and adapted especially to the needs of sheep. And it's used only for their benefit. The staff is essential as a symbol of concern, compassion, and compassion that the shepherd has for the sheep. No other single word can better describe its function on behalf of the flock than it's for their comfort. Comfort. Now, the rod conveys the concept of authority, power, discipline, defense against danger. But the staff now, that speaks of all that's long-suffering and kind. The shepherd's staff is normally a long, slender stick. And he sometimes has a crook on the end of it. You know what they look like. You've seen them. Seen pictures of them anyway. Now, it's selected with care by the owner, just like the rod is. And it's smooth, and it's cut to best suit the own personal use of the owner, just like the rod. And the staff then is used to guide the sheep. The shepherd gently uses it to press against the sides of the sheep, to move them to the right, to the left, and keep them on the right path. Keep them on the right path. God does that for us, doesn't he? Now, sometimes the sheep get off the path. They're looking for another little mouthful of food. There always are. And they get tangled up then in brushes and thorns and stuff. That's like we do too, don't we, sometimes? And in order to get remove them from that, the shepherd uses his staff because he doesn't want to get up and tangled up those thorns himself. And he gets them out of that situation. God uses his staff to move us out of situations. And interesting enough, when you find when a shepherd finds a sheep that's cast down, remember that's laying on their back with their little feet going in the air, he'll often use that hook to upright the sheep, get him standing up on his all fours. So that staff takes care of them. While the rod defends them, the staff cares for them. Just as the rod is emblematic of the Word of God, so the staff of God is a symbolic of the Spirit of God. In Christ's dealings with us as individuals, there's an essence of the sweetness, comfort, and consolation and gentle correction brought about by the work of his gracious Spirit. That's his use of his staff and his rod for us. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. I'm sorry I reverted back to my King James, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup runs over. Next time, we're going to talk about him preparing that table before you in the presence of your enemies. His anointing your head with oil. Boy, that's a good one. And your cup running over. Think about that. Meantime, remember, I love you. You're in my prayers. Have a wonderful week. God bless.